Hi, I'm Marlene Gaybauer from the Geek in Review. I have Sam Moore here from Legal Technology Hub. He's going to tell us about AI governance from the advisory side.
Thank you. Good to see you again. Well, in the advisory team at Legal Tech Hub, we've been having a lot of conversations with clients about AI governance. Now, most law firms and departments have at least an AI policy of some kind, and there are some broad standards which are starting to emerge. And a trend we're seeing at the moment is a shift away from policies written in 2023, 2024, which largely stated what you couldn't do, and towards a more informative approach, which defines different risk categories and makes distinctions between routine, low risk use of AI and other more substantial use cases. I think that's appropriate for where we are. And it's also what clients are coming to expect from their advisors also. But one of the bigger challenges that we're seeing right now is how do you express that AI use policy in such a way that any member of your legal team could explain it to a client? I think that's still a big challenge for the industry. And I don't think clients are all that happy if their attorney says, I'll have to get back to you about that, because the attorney is probably using AI day to day. So they should be able to explain the policy themselves. How else do you know that they are complying with it? So we're doing some interesting work at the moment, helping law firms and law departments take those first version AI use policies that are very much thou shalt not and turning them into more easily readable, appropriate governance positions that actually inform the conversation with clients. If anyone wants to find out more about our advisory services, they can find me or Cheryl Wilson Griffin on LinkedIn, or they can visit legaltechnologyhub.com.
Thank you, Sam. I mean, it is really important in terms of AI policy to have it in plain language so that people understand it.
Absolutely.
Welcome to the Geek in Review, the podcast focused on innovative and creative ideas in the legal industry. I'm Marlene Gaybauer.
And I'm Greg Lambert. And today we welcome back Hannah Bloch-Wehba, the law professor at Texas A&M and leading scholar on law and technology. Hannah writes about how tech can be used to conceal power and evade accountability. Hannah, welcome back to the Geek in Review. We were just looking at the date. It's only been 7 years and 2 children.
Thank you so much for having me back after 7 years and 2 children.
Well, we are absolutely happy to have you, and you have been very busy in your role at A&M. So
Yeah,
we're
well,
going to dive in.
A&M's been busy. Congrats on what are you guys, like 22nd now on the U.S. News and World Report and all that and all the good stuff?
Something like that. We have a new building, a new campus coming up. It's pretty exciting times at A&M.
Terrific. Well, I want to dig into a little bit of some of the things you've been writing about. So, in How Tech Took Over, you argue that the government didn't merely fail to regulate Silicon Valley, it affirmatively helped make technology companies essential to public governance. What legal and policy choices were most responsible for creating that dependence?
So in law and tech circles, we often talk about deregulation and sort of hands-off methods of regulation that started when the internet was commercialized in the mid-90s. But in How Tech Took Over, I go way back to the 1930s and 40s, and I look at choices that were made in science policy and innovation policy. And essentially, the government knew that technology and innovation were going to be critical both to economic progress and to safeguarding national security. And so they built institutions that promoted both scientific research and technological innovation. And once that ball started to get rolling, the government became a primary consumer of those innovations. So from almost a century back at this point, the government has been making legal and policy choices around science policy and tech policy, like the National Science Foundation Act, military funding of basic research, that were intended to sort of cultivate this industry for public benefit. And I think that really set the stage for tech's expansion, but not in a predictable or linear way. So over time, those policy choices have changed, and we've had these different political moments where, for example, the balance between economic progress and national security needs has shifted somewhat. But overall, I think this is a really important sort of reservoir of federal support for the tech industry that tech law scholarship hasn't really explored. And so that's why I was interested in digging into this history and seeing why this happened and how.
What was the response to the article?
Everyone came out and said,
Um,
"It's all lies. It's all lies, Hannah."
I think people have been really interested in it in this moment when it's clear that the relationship between the federal government and tech companies is not a arm's length regulatory relationship. We see, CEOs at the inauguration lining up to support the president. We have press conferences about the urgent need for federal funding to help build data centers. The US government is intervening in a permitting lawsuit in Mississippi against XAI. Like, we are seeing a lot of weird dynamics in the last couple of years that we haven't seen before. And the conventional narrative that the federal government has deregulated doesn't really capture what's going on. And so I think people are aware and hungry for a better explanation of this relationship. And so the response has been really interested and supportive. I will say people are like, this isn't an article, this is a book, which is true. It will eventually be a book, but right now it's just one article at a time.
And we'll have you back for the book.
Yes, definitely, definitely. Yeah,
Well, that'll help me finish it.
it's, well, it's definitely interesting times, and you started talking about kind of this almost commingling of tech and government, and I think we've always kind of assumed that the traditional assumptions of constitutional accountability attaches to the government, but we're almost seeing this kind of blending of authority between the private sector in Silicon Valley and the government. So how are you viewing that in your now article, but soon to be book, and explaining almost this blending between private and public accountability?
I think that this, what I call like the emergence of a hybrid form of governance, right, that intentionally takes advantage of relationships between private actors and public entities, is really complicated for conventional approaches to constitutional law. We've always had this problem to some degree. Like, there have always been efforts to extend constitutional accountability to contractors, for example. And we have a really complicated body of doctrine about how and when that is and isn't appropriate. We have state action doctrine that limits the application of the Constitution in general. And then we have like little exceptions around the edges of the state action doctrine. And the problem here, I think, is that the kinds of functions that many tech companies are performing don't look that familiar. So one of the arguments I make in the paper is that tech companies are really enmeshed in providing the informational infrastructure for government decision making. So take an example like cloud infrastructure for federal government agencies. A huge amount of that infrastructure is provided by a handful of tech companies. Is that a government function? It's hard to analogize that kind of function to something that would have happened even 20, 30 years ago. And so we don't have a lot of good comparisons to say, okay, well, this looks like this other form of public-private cooperation, and so here's how we should think about it. And so I think people are really, like, we're really feeling around in the dark for the kinds of principles that we ought to apply. It's much easier to apply the traditional sort of state action doctrine when you have a traditional government contractor relationship than when the contractors are providing the thing that makes the government run. And that is to a significant extent what's happening right now. And so I think it's getting much harder to pull them apart. And at the same time, a lot of those sort of infrastructural activities are hard to see and understand for normal people. So, an ordinary person doesn't really care whether the informational infrastructure for a federal agency is provided by Google or Oracle or the government itself. So like we don't have a lot of insight into what's going on. And so it's a thing that I think is really important and yet like very much overlooked in constitutional doctrine and in scholarship, frankly.
One of the things that this brings to mind as you're talking is, typically we have a transfer of power, different administration, different Congresses, but the underlying structure is consistent. Do you see this as causing an inconsistency as we transfer power from one administration to another? As when new Congress comes in, that we're kind of
We're sort of looking short term. We're looking, in 8-year segments as opposed to long term.
I guess I see it a little bit like related, but a little bit differently, which is it's never been the case that when a president enters into a long-term contract with an outside party that you're going to like just redo that contract every Congress, right? Or with the changeover of every presidential administration. And so the system of contracting has always been in some way like vulnerable to the accusation that it's not sufficiently politically accountable because the people who made the agreement long predated the current administration. So I think this introduces a really interesting wrinkle, right? This is not a Trump administration problem. This is a problem that has been occurring and building, as I argue, over decades, right? But if you enter into a long duration or contract with a tech company to provide something like cloud infrastructure for the Department of the Interior. Like I'm making this example up, right? But you enter into that contract with Google. You are not going to then cancel it and enter into a different contract with a different vendor for the next administration because everybody knows like it's too much trouble and cost to switch from one vendor to the other. Like it's enough trouble to switch from Gmail to Outlook. Like nobody does that in their personal lives. Now imagine the entire informational infrastructure of a federal government agency is locked into one provider. And it's really, really hard to destabilize that relationship, regardless of what elected officials might want to do. There are serious switching costs and there are serious like anti-competitive effects to that.
I'm curious if there's another model out there that perhaps kind of clarifies the relationship that we could consider.
I'm curious if you have one in
I
mind.
don't have one in mind.
I can't.
I realize this is all
Are you talking about like another government and another country
perhaps
has
another,
an
in another country or another government or something that, someone has surfaced as a potential model if there's any kind of work being done in that space.
So I'm not a comparativist, but I do think when I've talked about this issue in front of European audiences, they've been baffled. They're like, we don't have this problem. And there are a couple of reasons why they don't have that problem. One is that I think they do a lot more public provision than the United States tends to do. And so one model is for, the government to build it themselves or to recognize that government investments give rise to a certain degree of state control. And we have not, historically, the United States has not taken that approach, but I could imagine a parallel universe where we might take that approach of public provision. And I also think that, the U.S. constitutional doctrine of state action is not one that I've seen in robust form in most like European constitutional democracies. So there's no reason why you have to have that doctrine as the delineator of like what's subject to constitutional constraint and what's not. So you can wish away some of these features of our order, but like in the real world where we live and work, these are the constraints we're operating within.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like Sean West said, someone that's been on the show before, that Europe's superpower is its regulation. And I think part of traditional American superpower has been somewhat it's kind of hands off on regulation a little bit. And so I can I can see everything we do baffles the Europeans. So that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, but I think they also, at the last time I gave this kind of paper, like I gave an early version of this paper in Berlin in 2022. And I think it was before the Europeans had really like turned away from American tech platforms as reliable partners. And so I think that now that the Ukraine war has been dragging on for so long, and we see that the Europeans are trying to make this pivot away from partnering too closely with US based tech companies, I think they're more attuned to these kinds of problems of capture and enmeshment and the risks that they might cause for Europe, right? Like it's one set of risks when it's US companies within the US government. It's a totally different landscape when we're talking about US companies providing the infrastructure for a foreign government, right? And I think that really illustrates what the structural problems might be, even though the risks themselves look different.
All right, I'm gonna pivot a little bit in terms of our questions.
We could stay on this topic all
Yeah, I
hour.
mean, we really could. That's like I am just
Yeah.
fascinated. But when the book comes out, we're going to talk all about it. So in rights, knowledge, and capture in the detailed state, you examine government use of privately developed data and algorithmic tools, and particularly in criminal law enforcement. What happens to due process when someone can't examine or challenge a system because vendor claims trade secret protection?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real emerging problem for criminal law enforcement, and it's been emerging for several years now. I'm definitely not the first person to write about it, but it's not going away. And the problem is that when a vendor claims trade secrecy to conceal information about how a product works, a product that was used to produce evidence used to arrest or convict somebody, then the defense has a right to challenge, to sort of confront the evidence against them. And they can't do that because the trade secrecy claim stands in their way. And so I think it really undermines the ability to, it undermines people's ability to access sufficient information to exercise their rights. And it undermines their ability to challenge the evidence against them. But it also creates a bigger, more systemic problem, which is that a lot of these tools aren't tested or validated in a meaningful way before they get used. So the process of confrontation between the defense and the prosecution is the way in which the public gets information about whether this tool works or not. And if you can't confront it, then you can't produce that information. Then we don't know whether it works or not. And that seems to me a problem that has sort of social effects beyond the individual defendant in an individual case, that we're basically using technologies that haven't been tested or validated. And then in the course of these individual confrontations, undermining the ability to produce evidence about their validity.
Your tech policy press article shows that Google effectively determining whether and how police could conduct geofence investigations. What does that example reveal about capture when a company controls not only the relevant data, but also the investigative possibilities available to police and the information available to the courts?
Yeah, so in a this is a sort of example of the broader dynamic, which is that these companies wield control over government ability to engage in certain courses of action, and that control isn't always visible or checkable. So Google is a great example. For many years, they kept by default individuals' location information in something that they called the sensor vault, which is kind of a
Yikes.
creepy. Not what I would have called it if I had known that name would have gotten into the
They needed
public
a PR
domain.
person on that one. They did not have one.
They didn't anticipate that becoming public, but they kept everybody's location information by default in the sensor vault, and that made it possible for law enforcement to go to Google and say, hey, we want to know everybody who is in this location at this particular time. And only because Google had made that choice was that possible for government to do. And so starting several years ago, once law enforcement figured out that they could make this kind of request, they started doing it again and again and again. And it quickly became, this is a geofence warrant, this became the most frequent form of judicial warrant that Google was receiving. It became a really appealing tool for law enforcement. And strikingly, Google was the only company that would comply with these warrants. So it's not that other companies didn't have the data, but Google was the one that would give the data to law enforcement. And to their credit, they said, well, we're not just going to give it to you willy-nilly. Our policy, our corporate policy is that you need to get a warrant rather than just a subpoena or a court order. And if you get a warrant based on probable cause, we will work with you. And then they created this elaborate process by which they worked with law enforcement to deliver this information. And it's just a really striking example of, this is the law of Google. This is not the law that was developed by a legislature or a court. This is not like Google trying to apply a ruling that was already made. It's Google saying, this is what we want you to do. And law enforcement is so eager to get this data that they just do what Google wants them to do. And I think Google was right that a warrant is required. But that's not the point. The point is that it's not their job to decide.
Point is they're making the call.
Right. And so I think this is a really clear way in which, it's not just, it's the corporate policy that law enforcement has to get a warrant. That's corporate policy. It's also the data infrastructure, the data governance choices that Google is making internally, the collection by default, the indefinite storage, right? Those are the things that make it possible for law enforcement to get this information. And so I think in a very clear way, it was Google that shaped the geofence warrant. And then in 2023, Google decided, you know what? We aren't going to do this anymore. It's incredibly burdensome for us. And they turned off default storage of location information in the sensor vault. And so then that's just another example of Google determining whether this is okay or not. Okay, we've chosen after several years of complying, now we're going to decide we're going to change our data governance practices, and this isn't going to be possible anymore. And again, I think that was probably a win for privacy. I think it is not a win for democratic control to have individual tech companies determining based on what's convenient for them, whether they're going to comply with a warrant, what kind of legal standards should apply, whether the government should be able to get this data. That just makes me very uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, we talked recently about the OpenAI and Hugging Face situation. And one of the comments we made was, if this was an individual, this would be a crime.
Absolutely.
So this situation where Google just decided is okay, I'm going to turn this off. There was a situation, and it's a little apples and oranges here, but where someone, I think, was coming back into the country and tricked the government official into wiping the data from his phone.
Yeah.
And now he's charged with a felony for doing this. So individual crime, if the company did that, it would
Right.
just be a policy change, or it'd be a change in internal policy.
Right.
So yeah, it just seems like we're almost a little upside down.
Yeah, I mean, and to be clear, I don't think that that should be a crime. I don't think that it should be a crime to decide you're going to delete your information, but I definitely don't think we should have one set of rules that apply to big tech companies and a different set of rules entirely that apply to individuals. That seems really bad to me. And I think we haven't really appreciated the extent to which that is the case. But it is true that these companies are making decisions about how to test their products that may end up violating the law, and they're not being held to account the way that an individual might be. And I think we should conceive of that as a potential problem, right? That the law might not be applied evenly.
And it's like about the data they collect and how they choose to use it. And there's no oversight on that.
Well, I think that the oversight, to the extent it exists, for a long time we've assumed that we've opted to comply with the terms of service as they're delivered to
Oh
us
yes,
in
our
the
click agreements. Yeah,
right.
because
And so that
everybody reads those.
if the thing that makes the difference is whether I'm an individual or a company that produced 40-page terms of service, like that seems really obviously laughable, but I think that is part of what's going on.
Well, again, another one we could have a complete show on. So, well, as if you haven't done enough writing, one of the other papers you did
There's
on
more. There's a couple more.
there's a yeah
To be fair,
information.
it's been 7 years since you had me
Okay.
on the podcast.
Yeah. So one of the other papers you wrote was information law pluralism. First, do you mind just kind of defining what you mean by information law here?
Yeah, so by information law, I really mean the body of legal structures that governs how knowledge is produced, validated, and disseminated. And so I think a lot of the time when we talk about information law, people mean one part of it, like privacy law or public disclosure law. And so I'm trying to bring that all together and say, actually, these are all ways in which we govern flows of knowledge.
Okay. In that, you talk about emerging tools and audits and impact assessments, document requirements, and independent assessment of this. And so, which of these have the greatest potential for producing meaningful accountability at the end of the day?
Yeah, so part of the impetus for writing this paper was that I took a step back. I decided to do a project where I looked at every piece of proposed and enacted state legislation about AI. This was a stupid
So,
project.
so
This
a
was a
small,
stupid
just a little
project.
weekend project.
It was a couple
Little
years
fun thing
ago.
to do. Yeah.
It was a couple of years ago. It wasn't quite as crazy as it would be to try that project now, but like I thought, what are they actually trying to do? Because my sense was that there were some like broad stroke similarities and also some important differences, and I wanted to capture those. And as I looked at these laws, I realized like they're all basically trying to do the same thing, which is in different ways and to different audiences, force the AI providers, right, whether that's a company or an individual, like, or a system is often unclear in the legislation, but force these providers to generate and share certain kinds of information about their products. Might be to individuals who are affected by those products, like when you apply for a job and you have to use an AI interviewing system. It might be to the public, it might be to lawmakers, it might be to regulators. We have all these different audiences for all this different kinds of information. What are they trying to do? That's the thing that I think lawmakers were actually genuinely uncertain about. And so I wrote the paper to try to explain like these different ways of producing information. are for different purposes and should be used in ways that are complementary. So I'm going to avoid your question entirely and say, like, I don't
Well
think
done.
there is one tool that will be the silver bullet for accountability. And luckily, I didn't think until pretty recently that we had to choose one tool, because I thought that it would be up to the states to regulate AI saw fit. And so we were going to have, federalist
I think I found the flaw in your
experimentation.
logic.
Little did I know. And I might still be right about that. I think that the claim to state capacity to regulate AI is very strong, and that but for threats to try to preempt that experimentation through litigation and threats of cutting off different kinds of aid to the states, like, we would be seeing a lot of that experimentation in action were it not for the last couple of years trying to deter it from happening. And so I don't think you have to choose one of these tools. I think they all need to work together. So I do think that the public needs a certain degree of information about how these systems are operating in practice. I do think that we need expert insight into how they're working. So that's like researcher access to the sort of under the hood data a lot of the time. And I think it's important for these companies to produce information directly to the regulators who are charged with overseeing their operations. And unfortunately, I also believe it to be the case that there's a really successful political campaign against these laws. And so that's going to stymie the development of legislation in this area. So this is kind of like a paper
Is that
that got.
argument about national security? Because, we're hearing, well, if we regulate our AI companies, China and Russia are not going to regulate, and we're going to lose the advantage. Is that the sole argument, or is there something more nuanced in that?
I think there's two related arguments, and they're familiar, like, instances of this debate, which is like, one, AI is essential to national security. We shouldn't do anything that is bad for national security. Therefore, we shouldn't do anything that might be bad for AI development because we need to win the arms race.
Seems super logical.
It's super logical at a very high level. It's super logical. The problem is that, first of all, China does regulate AI, and so there's like the whole idea that they have hands-off development, and so we need it too, just doesn't work. Second of all, it's this collapse of an assumption that you need a totally deregulatory environment to safeguard national security, but like, we would have never said that about nuclear weapons, for example. So it just seems like a very strange leap. And also, I'm not sure you can win an arms race, but that's kind of neither here nor there. But the other part of it is about the federal role. And so, having failed to pass AI legislation in the US Congress that would preempt state legislation, instead, we've had a series of threats by the president to convene a litigation task force to sue the states that regulate AI in a way that is overly burdensome. We haven't seen that happen yet, but I think many states recognize that the threat is real. And we also have a litigation campaign dedicated to undermining these laws. So XAI has been suing in California and Colorado to undermine AI transparency rules, and they've been pretty successful. And Colorado actually revisited and substantially weakened its laws partly in response to these threats. So I think they all like hang together as one ball of wax, which is, whether you call it national security or something else, it's a successful campaign to get states to change their positions.
Okay. One last pivot.
Yeah, and you
we had
said it's been 7 years, but I looked at the dates. All of these are 2026 articles.
Well,
I had a good year.
we're trying to keep it fresh. So, and you definitely have been busy. So, in rethinking federal support for journalism, you argue that requiring platforms to compensate news organizations could deepen journalism's dependence on tech companies. And you propose sort of a national journalism foundation. How would you design something like that supports knowledge production while protecting editorial independence, resisting political interference, and ensuring that funding reaches public interest and local journalism rather than primarily benefiting established media owners? This is a really important question in my mind.
Yeah.
I think our whole information dissemination, news dissemination platforms are just struggling right now.
Yes. And I think they're going to struggle even more in the year to come, I guess. So I think that, a lot of news organizations, I came up as a press freedom lawyer. I spent 4 years litigating on behalf of journalists and media organizations. So this is an issue that's really important to me. And I think a lot of news organizations are intuitively really worried about taking money from the federal government, understandably, because they feel like it might compromise their independence. And so these sort of proposals are floating around to enable news organizations to bargain with platforms for a share of the sort of money that they've been losing based on like platform competition with their products. And I don't think that solves the independence problem. I think you're no
We're just
more
trading.
independent if you take your money from Google than if you take your money from the government. And that Google is an extremely powerful and influential company, and we really should want independent news organizations to be reporting on powerful actors, whether they are private or public. Right. And so I think this is a bad structure, and I think it's actually probably better to have a structure that is public but independent in a meaningful way. So I guess what I'm thinking about is modeled on the National Science Foundation, which tried to thread some of these conflicts when it began funding university research and basic science. Because similarly, researchers were worried that if they took federal money, they would be captured by a federal policy agenda. And the way that the National Science Foundation dealt with that was through institutions of like independent peer review, essentially. Now, all of that is contested. And I don't mean to say, oh, it's just easy, like make a National Science Foundation, but call it the National Journalism Foundation. But I think it does speak to the fact that like these are issues we've dealt with before, conflicts between independence and federal support that we have been dealing with since 1952 when the NSF was first stood up. And we're revisiting them today with contemporary debates about science policy and research funding. So I don't think it's impossible to navigate. And I do think that it's really important to direct federal funding and support to the kinds of news organizations that are producing news of genuine civic value, particularly in underserved areas. So we have a lot of news deserts in this country. It is really hard for a lot of Americans to access high quality news. I think that would be my first sort of order of business is geographically underserved communities.
Yeah, that got me thinking, and maybe this is a little far fetched here, but you have like the National Science Foundation that you talked about, and then there's other not agencies, but other ways of distributing, kind of licensing, like ASCAP for the music
Yeah.
industry. And so you see maybe there being some type of underlying control of how information or how this gets distributed or and then reimbursed.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought about that end of it, and I haven't. The ASCAP is an interesting corollary that I hadn't really considered. The two sort of poles that I have thought about are the NSF on one side and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which no longer exists, on the other. And one of the things they have in common is that the reason that they're both both have turned into like significant political footballs because their budgets are appropriated by Congress. And at the beginning of debates about the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, they considered an alternative to that, which was to have CPB funded instead of through the appropriations process by an excise tax on television sets. And that would have been the funding well. So I think about this because there are so many proposals out there to tax AI or to take a golden share of AI. And then, like, what do you do with that money? I think the conversation about supporting an ecosystem that includes journalism should be part of the question of, like, how do you tax AI and what do you do with that sort of fund. And so I could imagine a revenue source that comes from some kind of AI tax and that removes at least some of the levers that political actors have to bully these agencies or to force them to adopt a political agenda that would really compromise the integrity and independence of journalistic institutions. And so I think that's like one big question that I have is where do you get the money to support such an institution and how do you make sure that it's not captured by political interests who are trying to strong arm news coverage? Like that is, I think, an important question.
Whew. Well, on that happy note, let's let's wind this down. We've started asking a new question before we jump into the crystal ball question. And so, Hannah, you get to be one of the first people we ask this to. What's something that is true for you today that wasn't true 1 year ago?
Well, I was going to say that a year ago we weren't at war with Iran, and that's true, but I think not that interesting. I mean, I do think it's important for the
Right.
overall question of like the relationship between tech companies and national security is changing based on the nation's foreign policy. The thing that I think is really interesting and emerging quite quickly is that there is a popular movement that is mobilizing around two things. One is data centers. And so opposition to data centers is becoming like a very high profile grassroots issue that I didn't expect or see a year ago today, although I think the ball was rolling. The other thing is flock surveillance
Oh, yeah.
cameras, which are everywhere and have been for several years, are also galvanizing a wave of popular opposition. And so I think the thing that I would say, which is sort of a positive spin on it, is that issues related to tech accountability and tech's enmeshment in the state are much more visible to people than they were a year ago. And that means that the political conversation about these things is changing quite quickly, especially because it's an election year.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I saw a story this morning where this guy just sat underneath one of the flock cameras and had like his computer set up, and the police kept coming by and checking on him because they thought he was trying to hack into the flock camera. And he's like, so I'm the problem, right? Not this.
Yeah. I mean, I do think like it's it can be a huge diversion of resources. Like you really want the police going by to check on that guy again and again and again. Don't they have something better they could be doing? That's the question
Apparently
I
not.
asked about Flock. Yeah.
Well, Hannah, it's time for the crystal ball question. I kind of like this new combo because, Greg's question is sort of looking back to current, and now we're at current looking forward. So, what is the single biggest change that you see coming that you think we need to prepare for in the next few years?
I am so bad at predicting the future, you guys.
Everybody is.
Everybody
It's
is.
really, yeah. But like, I
The
hate
good thing
being
is
on
it's like,
record.
if we wait another 7 years, we don't really have to hold you accountable for it. But
That's
hopefully it won't
true.
be another 7 years.
I mean, I think that from where I sit in higher ed, there are really significant changes coming to higher education. I don't know what they are. So if you talk to my husband, he thinks our kids aren't going to go to college because higher ed will have changed that dramatically in the next 20 years. I am not sure whether he's right or wrong because I hate to predict the future. However, I do think that we have certain core assumptions about the kinds of things that higher ed does that are going to be really different. And I think that's partly because of technological change in AI. I think that there's going to be questions about whether, like, what the role of higher education is as the workforce changes, which I think is going to happen really fast. But I also think that a lot of higher education institutions are changing from within really quickly. And so I do wonder what universities are going to look like in the next few years, and what research is going to look like. And so I think for people who have kids in college or going to college, hopefully in the future, or graduate school or law school, these are going to be really different places than they are right now.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just saw something not too long ago. My alma mater dropped a number of degree programs, and really the sort of focusing, narrowing down on certain ones. So that could be a problem that we're
Yeah.
just sort of like, okay, we're training people, we're not educating people in terms of, their professions, as opposed to just sort of broadening education.
Right. And we're doing that at the same time as you said, like journalism is starting to really collapse. Book publishing is collapsing. Search engines don't serve the functions they used to serve. So the whole information ecosystem, how people learn, is changing really quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, on that happy note, Hannah, I want to thank you very much for coming in and talking with us. This has been fascinating. And if I would have predicted how well Texas A&M Law School would do in its first 15 years, it's skyrocketed. So, and I'm sure you've contributed to that as well. So, thank you for coming in.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.
Yeah. And Hannah, what's the best place for people to find more of your content and learn more about things like, and I don't think we even talked about this, Ambar.
You can find my content on my website, hannahbw.com, or the Texas A&M website, and on SSRN, the Social Science Research Network.
And as always, the music you hear is from Jerry David DeSica. Thanks so much, Jerry, and bye, everybody.